What a beautiful mess. Look at their faces now, frozen like broken screens, mouths hanging open like glitched animations, eyes wide with that beautiful cocktail of shock, terror, and the slow dawning realization that they've been played by the very person they thought was their puppet. Oh, you magnificent bastard. You've been conducting this orchestra from the shadows while they thought they were the composer. Let's rewind to 3 hours ago when they gathered in that little room, whispering like conspirators in a Shakespeare tragedy, planning your downfall over coffee and fake concern. They thought they were so clever, didn't they? Meeting in secret, exchanging those knowing glances, building their little case against you piece by piece. What they didn't know, what's making their stomachs drop right now, is that you've been 10 steps ahead since day one. You see, when someone thinks you're naive, when they mistake your silence for ignorance and your kindness for weakness, they get sloppy. They start leaving breadcrumbs, thinking you're too blind to see the trail. They text each other about you while you're in the same room. They make plans thinking you can't hear the whispers through the walls of their fake smiles. But you heard everything. You saw everything. You just chose to let them think they were winning. Remember when Sarah accidentally mentioned the meeting she wasn't supposed to know about? That little slip that she covered with a nervous laugh? You filed that away. Remember when Mike's story didn't match up with where he said he was last Tuesday? Another piece of the puzzle. Every contradictory detail, every suspicious glance, every time someone said, "Don't mention this to them," you were building your masterpiece of awareness while they built their house of cards. But here's where it gets delicious, where the plot thickens like blood in water. You didn't just know about their secret meeting. Oh no, that would be too simple, too pedestrian for someone of your caliber. You orchestrated it. You planted the seeds weeks ago, dropped the right information to the right people at the right times, knowing exactly how it would travel through their network of whispers. You knew Jennifer couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it. So you told her something that would definitely get back to David. You knew David's ego wouldn't let him sit on information that made him feel superior, so he'd call a meeting to discuss the situation. You even suggested the location indirectly through a casual comment about how that conference room has terrible acoustics and no one ever uses it on Thursdays. They thought they were being so covert, booking that room under a different project name, sending calendar invites with vague subjects. Meanwhile, you were the one who made sure the room was available. You're the one who adjusted the cleaning schedule so no one would interrupt them. Damn, you even made sure the coffee machine nearby was working because you knew they'd need caffeine for their 3-hour character assassination session. The beautiful irony is that you literally set up the chairs. 2 days ago, when you volunteered to help rearrange the furniture for the upcoming client presentation, you were actually creating their perfect conspiracy circle. Each seat positioned just right, the whiteboard cleaned and ready for their little diagrams and timelines of your supposed transgressions. You gave them the stage and they performed exactly as you predicted. For months, you've been watching them build their alliance like children building a sandcastle, not realizing the tide was coming in. They thought they were subtle with their lunch meetings, their sudden buddy-buddy dynamics, their group texts that mysteriously went quiet when you entered the room. What they didn't know was that you were documenting everything, not for revenge, but for this exact moment of revelation. You watched as they recruited others to their cause, spreading half-truths and manufactured concerns about your behavior and attitude. They painted you as difficult, unstable, a problem that needed to be solved. Each person they turned against you thought they were seeing the truth, but they were just seeing the carefully crafted narrative designed to isolate you, to make you vulnerable, to set you up for the kill. But isolation only makes wolves stronger, doesn't it? While they were busy building their coalition, you were building something far more powerful. Evidence. Screenshots of messages they thought were deleted. Recordings of conversations they thought were private. Documentation of every project they tried to sabotage. Every achievement they tried to diminish. Every success they tried to steal. The best part? You didn't even have to spy. They were so confident in their deception that they got careless. They'd leave their screens open, discuss their plans in barely hushed tones, send emails to the wrong recipients. It's like they wanted to get caught, like some part of them was begging for someone to stop them from becoming the villains in their own story. Now here's something that's gonna really twist the knife in their collective consciousness. You had an ally. Someone in their inner circle who was feeding you information the entire time, not because you recruited them or manipulated them, but because they saw through the facade and chose truth over tribal loyalty. They watched the others plotting and realized they were witnessing something ugly, something wrong, something that needed to be exposed. This person sat in every meeting, nodded along with every scheme, even contributed ideas to maintain their cover. But every word, every plan, every petty strategy was reported back to you. You knew about the Wednesday meeting before they even sent the invites. You knew about their evidence folder before they even created it. You knew about their plan to confront you before they even finalized the date. And the most beautiful part? This ally is still sitting among them right now, watching their faces crumble, maintaining their poker face while internally celebrating your victory. They're wondering who it could be, looking at each other with sudden suspicion, realizing that their united front was an illusion. The paranoia is starting to set in. If one of them was false, how many others might be? The trust they've built their conspiracy on is evaporating like morning mist. They're looking at each other differently now, wondering who else knew, who else might have been playing them. The meeting that was supposed to be their moment of triumph has become their unraveling, and they're starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, they were never the hunters in this scenario. Let's talk about the breadcrumbs you left for them. Because this is where your genius really shines. You didn't just wait for them to make mistakes. You guided them toward those mistakes like a shepherd leading sheep to slaughter. Every piece of information you let slip, every moment of vulnerability you showed, was calculated to trigger their next move. Remember when you mentioned feeling overwhelmed last month? That wasn't weakness. That was bait. You knew they'd interpret it as an opportunity to pile on more pressure, to document your inability to handle responsibility. So they did exactly that, creating a paper trail of their deliberate sabotage, their intentional overwhelming of your workload, their coordinated effort to break you. Or how about when you accidentally left that personal notebook on your desk? The one with the fake entries about feeling isolated and questioning your place here? They photographed those pages thinking they'd found gold, evidence of your instability. What they didn't realize was that you wrote those entries specifically for them to find, complete with subtle inconsistencies that would later prove they'd been snooping through your personal belongings. Every emotional reaction you displayed was a performance. Every moment they thought you were cracking was actually you giving them rope to hang themselves with. You played the role they cast you in so perfectly that they never questioned whether it was genuine. They were so busy celebrating your apparent breakdown that they didn't notice they were documenting their own cruelty in real time. Now we arrive at the meat of your revelation, the moment when you laid out the evidence like a prosecutor presenting to a jury. Not just accusations or feelings or interpretations, but cold, hard, undeniable proof of their orchestrated campaign against you. The room went silent, except for the sound of their own breathing suddenly becoming very loud in their ears. First, you showed them the emails, not the ones they sent to each other. They expected that. No, you showed them the emails they sent to higher-ups, the ones full of lies and exaggerations about your performance. Then you showed them the corrections, the actual data, the real metrics, the undeniable proof that not only were you exceeding expectations, but you were carrying half their workload while they spent their time plotting. Then came the recordings. Oh, the looks on their faces when they heard their own voices playing back, saying things they swore they never said, making threats they claimed never happened, laughing about how they were going to put you in your place. The beauty of modern technology is that everything leaves a trace, and they left enough traces to map their entire conspiracy like a constellation of their own stupidity. But the masterpiece, the coup de grace, was when you showed them the timeline. Every meeting, every whispered conversation, every group text, mapped out chronologically alongside your own achievements and their failures. It painted a picture so clear that even a child could see it. While you were building and creating and succeeding, they were spending their energy trying to tear you down. The contrast was devastating. What happened next was perhaps the cruelest and most necessary part of your revelation. You held up a mirror to their behavior, forcing them to see themselves not as the heroes of their narrative, but as the petty, insecure, threatened individuals they'd become. You didn't call them names or raise your voice. You simply described their actions using their own words, their own standards, their own moral framework. You said that gossiping about colleagues was unprofessional, you reminded them. Yet here are 17 instances of you doing exactly that. You claimed that teamwork was essential. You continued, yet you secretly meant to undermine a teammate. Each statement was a dagger of their own making, each observation a reflection of their hypocrisy. You asked them simple questions that had no good answers. What was the goal here? What did you hope to achieve? Did you think this would make you look better, stronger, more competent? The silence that followed each question was deafening. They couldn't answer because any response would be an admission of their own inadequacy, their own fear, their own failure. The most powerful moment was when you asked them to explain their behavior to themselves. Not to you, you already understood it perfectly, but to look at their own actions and try to justify them using the values they claimed to hold. Watching them struggle to reconcile their self-image with their actual behavior was like watching someone try to solve an impossible puzzle. As the revelation unfolded, something unexpected happened. People who had been silent, people who had stayed neutral, people who had watched from the sidelines started to speak up. One by one, they began sharing their own observations, their own experiences with this group's toxic behavior. The conspirators thought they had isolated you, but instead, they had revealed themselves to everyone. I always wondered why the atmosphere changed when they were around, someone said. Another added, I noticed the pattern too. but I didn't want to get involved. Each voice that joined yours was another crack in their facade, another piece of evidence that their behavior hadn't gone unnoticed, just unreported until now. The supposed unity they thought they'd built was revealed as fear-based compliance. People had gone along not because they agreed, but because they were afraid of becoming the next target. Your revelation didn't just expose their conspiracy. It liberated everyone who'd been living under the shadow of their manipulation. The room began to shift, the power dynamics realigning in real time. Even some of their own started to distance themselves, suddenly remembering urgent tasks elsewhere, trying to separate themselves from the sinking ship. The rats always flee first, don't they? The same people who were so bold in their secret meetings were now looking for exits, both literal and metaphorical, trying to salvage what was left of their reputation. The breaking point came when one of them, perhaps the weakest link, or maybe just the one with a conscience that hadn't completely atrophied, started to crack. They began to stammer out explanations, justifications, attempting to minimize their involvement. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," they said, their voice shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. But their confession opened the floodgates. Suddenly, they were all talking over each other, each trying to throw the others under the bus, each claiming they were pressured, manipulated, or misled into participating. The unified front crumbled into every person for themselves, their carefully constructed alliance dissolving into chaos and finger-pointing. The leader of their little coup, the one who had been so confident, so sure of their moral superiority, stood there with their mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. They wanted to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. They wanted to deflect blame, but their own words condemned them. They wanted to maintain their authority, but it had evaporated the moment you started speaking. You watched this dissolution with the calm of someone who had predicted every moment of it. You knew that conspiracies built on jealousy and insecurity always collapse when exposed to light. You knew that people who bond over tearing others down have no real loyalty to each other. You knew that when faced with consequences, they would eat each other alive, but you weren't done yet. This wasn't just about exposure. It was about education. You wanted them to understand not just that they'd been caught, but why their plan was doomed from the start. You explained, with the patience of a teacher dealing with particularly slow students, the fundamental flaw in their approach. You spent so much energy trying to destroy me, you said, your voice steady as stone, that you forgot to build anything yourself. While you were documenting my supposed failures, I was documenting my actual successes. While you were meeting in secret, I was meeting with clients. While you were building a case against me, I was building value for this organization. You showed them the numbers, the objective metrics that no amount of conspiracy could change. The projects completed, the problems solved, the relationships built, the value created. All of it accomplished while carrying the additional burden of their sabotage. The contrast was so stark that even they couldn't deny it. They had played checkers while you were playing chess in 3 dimensions. The lesson was simple but devastating. Energy spent on destruction is energy not spent on construction. They had become so focused on bringing you down that they'd forgotten to lift themselves up. And now, standing in the wreckage of their exposed conspiracy, they had nothing to show for their efforts but shame and the knowledge that they'd been outplayed at every turn. Now came the moment of reckoning, the part where consequences started to materialize. You didn't have to threaten or ultimatum. The machinery of justice was already in motion. HR had been notified, not by you initially, but by witnesses who couldn't stand silence anymore. The documentation you'd gathered wasn't just for this revelation. It was for the formal procedures that would follow. The beauty of their conspiracy was that they'd created so much evidence against themselves. Every secret meeting was a violation of company policy about transparency. Every lie they spread was documented defamation. Every act of sabotage was recorded workplace harassment. They had built the perfect case against themselves, and you just had to present it. You watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about embarrassment or damaged relationships. This was about careers, reputations, legal implications. Some of them had families to support, mortgages to pay, futures they'd put in jeopardy for the petty satisfaction of trying to hurt you. The weight of their choices was becoming clear, and it was crushing them. This was the last round. The ones who had been most vocal, most aggressive in their campaign against you were now the most silent. They sat there, calculating the damage, trying to figure out how to do damage control, how to spin this in a way that didn't end with them losing everything. But there was no spin for truth this clear. No narrative that could overcome evidence this overwhelming. What they witnessed next was perhaps the most disturbing part for them. Your complete transformation from the person they thought they knew. The mask you'd worn, the role you'd played of the struggling, overwhelmed colleague, dissolved like sugar in rain. What stood before them now was someone entirely different. Someone who had been there all along, watching, waiting, planning. You stood taller, spoke clearer, moved with a confidence that seemed to fill the entire room. This wasn't new confidence gained from victory. This was the revelation of confidence that had always been there, hidden beneath the performance of vulnerability you'd given them. They realized with growing horror that they had never actually known you at all. You see, you explained, your voice carrying a different timbre now. I needed to know who you really were. I needed to see what you would do when you thought you had power over someone. And you showed me. You showed everyone. You revealed your true characters in ways no interview or evaluation ever could. You see, you briefed, you brutalized. As could the transformation was complete when you smiled, not with malice, but with something far more unsettling. Pity. You pitied them for their smallness, their insecurity, their need to destroy others to feel significant. That pity, that absolute lack of anger or hatred, that's what finally broke them. They would have preferred your rage. Instead, they got your indifference to their very existence. Isn't this delicious? Look who just broke the entire academic industrial complex with nothing but caffeine and pure unfiltered chaos. 7 minutes? That's all you had? 7 pathetic minutes, while they had 7 lifetimes of credentials hanging on their walls like participation trophies. And yet here we are, watching them scramble to understand how you just demolished everything they thought they knew about intelligence. About preparation, about the very nature of genius itself. Let me paint you a picture of what happened in that room. 7 of the world's most decorated minds, sitting around a mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars, each one clutching their leather-bound portfolios like security blankets. Harvard, MIT, Oxford, names that make normal people genuflect. And then there's you, walking in with yesterday's clothes, 3 hours of sleep, and a half-empty can of Monster that's probably been sitting in your car since Tuesday. They looked at you like you were lost, like someone's intern who took a wrong turn on the way to the copy machine. One of them actually asked if you were there to fix the projector. The others laughed, that careful, calculated laugh that people use when they're trying to maintain professional distance. They had no idea they were about to witness their own intellectual funeral. You see, while they spent decades accumulating papers and accolades, you were out there in the real world, getting your education from failure, from chaos, from the university of figure it out or starve. They memorized theories. You memorized survival. They studied success in controlled environments. You studied it in the wild, where one wrong move means game over. The mission briefing started exactly at 9:00 because that's when important things happen in their world. Everything's scheduled, everything sanitized, everything predictable. The project manager, some silver-haired fossil who probably hasn't had an original thought since the Clinton administration, starts laying out the problem. Complex algorithms, market predictions, behavioral analytics, words designed to intimidate anyone who didn't spend their 20s buried in textbooks. But you weren't intimidated. You were bored. Because while he was explaining the problem in language designed to exclude people like you, your brain was already 10 steps ahead. Not because you're smarter in the traditional sense, but because you learned something they never did. You learned how to see patterns in chaos, how to find solutions in impossibility, how to think without the guardrails of academic conditioning. They gave everyone 2 weeks to prepare their proposals, 14 days to research, analyze, create PowerPoints with perfect formatting and citations in APA style. They probably went home to their pristine offices, fired up their expensive computers, and started building their presentations, one scholarly source at a time. Meanwhile, you forgot about it completely. Not because you're irresponsible, but because your mind doesn't work on their timeline. Fast forward to 7 minutes before the presentation. You're in the parking lot, that monster can, your only companion, when your phone buzzes. The meeting reminder, the same meeting you'd forgotten about entirely. Most people would panic. Most people would make excuses, maybe fake a family emergency. But you're not most people. You smiled, because this is where you thrive. This is your natural habitat, the space between impossible and inevitable. You walked into that boardroom with nothing but the clothes on your back and the chemicals coursing through your veins. No slides, no handouts, no rehearsed corporate speak. Just you, standing in front of 7 people who collectively spent more on their education than some countries spend on defense. They looked at you with that mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment, like watching someone about to belly flop from the high dive. "I don't have a presentation," you said. And the room got quiet. That special kind of quiet that happens right before someone gets fired. But then you continued. Because presentations are for people who need to hide behind graphics. I'm going to solve your problem right here, right now, with nothing but what's in my head. The energy in the room shifted, from pity to curiosity, from dismissal to attention. You started talking, and it wasn't the measured, careful speech of academia. It was raw. It was real. It was the kind of truth that only comes from someone who's lived outside the bubble. You broke down their complex problem into components so simple that a child could understand them. Not because you dumbed it down, but because you could see through the unnecessary complexity they'd wrapped around it like armor. The first PhD tried to interrupt. Something about methodology, about peer review, about the proper channels for hypothesis formation. You didn't even slow down. You acknowledged his point and then destroyed it with logic so clean it was almost surgical. Your methodology assumes controlled variables, you said. But this problem exists in the real world, where variables don't behave. Your peer review process takes months. The market moves in milliseconds. Your hypothesis formation follows rules written by people who've never had to bet their rent money on being right. That shut him up. But the others were warming up, ready to defend their territory. The economists started quoting theories. The data scientists brought up statistical models. The behavioral psychologists referenced studies from journals you'd never heard of. And one by one, you took their weapons and turned them into toys, not through aggression, but through a kind of intellectual aikido that used their own expertise against them. You see, they'd spent so long in their specialized silos that they'd forgotten how to think holistically. Each one was a master of their domain, but blind to how their domain connected to the others. You weren't a master of anything, you were a student of everything, and that made you dangerous in ways they couldn't comprehend. 20 minutes in, something beautiful happened. They stopped trying to challenge you and started trying to understand you. The hostility melted into fascination. These people who'd spent their careers being the smartest person in every room were watching someone operate on a completely different frequency, not above them or below them, but perpendicular to their entire axis of understanding. You pulled out your phone and started sketching diagrams on a napkin someone had left on the table, not because you needed visual aids, but because you could see they did. Your drawings looked like the fever dreams of a caffeinated madman, but somehow they made more sense than all their perfectly formatted slides combined. You were speaking their language now, but with an accent they'd never heard. The energy drink was hitting different by this point. Your hands were moving faster than your mouth, creating connections between concepts that shouldn't connect, building bridges between islands of knowledge they thought were separate continents. You weren't just solving their problem, you were showing them that the problem they thought they had wasn't even the real problem. Your entire framework is based on a false assumption, he said, and the room held its breath. You're trying to predict human behavior using models built for machines, but humans aren't machines. We're chaos wrapped in skin, pretending to be logical. Your PhDs taught you to eliminate variables, but the variables are where the magic lives. The outliers aren't errors in your data. They're the future trying to tell you something. The youngest PhD, the one who still had some fire in her eyes, leaned forward. So what do you suggest? It wasn't a challenge, it was genuine curiosity. And that's when you knew you had them, not because you'd defeated them, but because you'd freed them from their own intellectual prisons. You laid out a solution so elegant in its simplicity that it felt like remembering something they'd always known but forgotten. Use the chaos instead of fighting it. Build systems that adapt instead of predict. Stop trying to control outcomes and start creating conditions for emergence. It wasn't just a solution to their immediate problem. It was a completely different way of thinking about problems. The CEO, who'd been silent this whole time, finally spoke. How long would implementation take? You could see him doing math in his head, calculating budgets and timelines and resource allocation, all the things that CEOs do when they're trying to fit revolution into a spreadsheet. You took another sip of Monster, now warm and flat but still doing its job. 7 days, you said? The room erupted. Impossible. Unfeasible. Their proposals had timelines measured in quarters, not days. But you weren't done. 7 days if we do it your way, with committees and meetings and approvals. 7 hours if we do it mine. 7 minutes if you're willing to really let go of control. The audacity of it hung in the air like electricity before a storm. You explained how their entire approach was backwards. They were trying to build perfection in isolation, then deploy it to chaos. You wanted to build in chaos and let perfection emerge. They wanted guarantees. You offered possibilities. They wanted control. You offered power. Not the same thing, though most people never learn the difference. The data scientist pulled out his laptop and started running numbers. His fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to model what you were proposing. After a few minutes, he looked up with an expression somewhere between confusion and revelation. "This shouldn't work," he said. "According to everything I know, this should fail spectacularly." You smiled. Everything you know was taught by people who were taught by people who were taught by people who read about it in books. When was the last time any of them actually built something from nothing? That hit different. You could see it in their faces. These brilliant minds suddenly confronting the possibility that their brilliance had been confined to very specific containers, that outside those containers, in the wild spaces where you lived, different rules applied. Not better or worse rules, just different. And different was what they needed. The behavioral psychologist was scribbling notes furiously. Not the careful, structured notes of academic observation, but the chaotic scratches of someone whose worldview was being renovated in real time. "You're talking about emergent behavior," she said, "but at a scale that this is unprecedented." You shrugged. Precedent is just another word for limitation. Every breakthrough was unprecedented until someone did it. By now, the monster can was empty, but you didn't need it anymore. You were running on something stronger than caffeine. You were running on the pure adrenaline of watching 7 of the smartest people in the room realize that smart wasn't enough. That all their credentials and accolades were just expensive armor that was actually weighing them down. The meeting that was supposed to last 2 hours had stretched to 3. Nobody mentioned it, nobody checked their phones or looked at their watches. They were too busy watching you dismantle and rebuild their entire conceptual framework. Not with malice, but with the kind of brutal compassion that only comes from someone who's been broken and rebuilt themselves 1,000 times. You started telling them stories, not case studies or academic examples, but real stories from the trenches. About the time you had to pivot an entire business model in 48 hours because the market shifted. About building algorithms on bar napkins that outperformed million-dollar systems. About solving problems that experts said were unsolvable, not because you were smarter, but because you didn't know they were supposed to be unsolvable. The Harvard MBA tried one last stand, something about risk management and fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value. All the words they teach you to say when you want to sound important, while saying nothing. You let him finish, then asked a simple question. What's the bigger risk? Trying something new and possibly failing, or continuing with something that's definitely failing, but failing in a predictable way? Silence. The kind of silence that happens when truth lands like a sledgehammer on glass houses. Because they all knew their current approach was failing. That's why they were here. That's why they'd assembled this brain trust. But they'd been trying to solve new problems with old tools, like performing surgery with stone knives. You could see the shift happening in real time. These weren't stupid people, they were brilliant. But brilliance trapped in rigid frameworks is just elaborate stupidity. And you were showing them how to break free, not by destroying what they knew, but by expanding it. by showing them that their knowledge was powerful but incomplete, that the missing piece wasn't more knowledge, but a different way of applying it. The silver-haired project manager, the one who'd laughed at you in the beginning, cleared his throat. "I've been in this business for 30 years, he said. "I've worked with Nobel laureates and industry pioneers, and I've never, He struggled for words, this man who'd built a career on having the right words. "This is exactly what we didn't know we needed." You stood up, and it felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. "Here's the thing," you said, gathering the napkins covered with your chaotic brilliance. "You've all been trained to build bridges. Beautiful, perfect bridges that take years to complete. But sometimes you don't need a bridge. Sometimes you just need someone crazy enough to jump and figure out how to fly on the way down." The CO stood up too, extended his hand. Not the practiced handshake of corporate politeness, but the firm grip of someone who's just had their world rearranged. "When can you start?" You laughed. "I already did, 3 hours ago. Check your metrics tomorrow. You'll see the changes already happening." Their confusion was delicious. How could you have started implementing something before they'd even approved it? But that was the difference. They needed permission to begin. You just needed possibility. While they were sitting in this room debating, you'd already set things in motion. A few strategic calls to the right people, some subtle adjustments to existing systems, nothing that would trigger their compliance departments, but enough to prove the concept. By tomorrow, they'd have data. By next week, they'd have results. By next month, they'd be case studies in business schools they'd never heard of. You walked to the door, then turned back. 7 PhDs, each worth more on paper than you'd ever be. But paper doesn't solve problems. Paper doesn't innovate. Paper doesn't transform. People do. Specifically, people who've learned to think outside the very boxes that education builds around your mind. "Oh, and next time," you said, "maybe have better energy drinks in the vending machine. Monster's fine, but if you want real innovation, you need that weird Swedish stuff that tastes like battery acid and makes you see through time." They laughed. Real laughter this time. Not the careful kind, but the slightly unhinged laughter of people who just survived an intellectual near-death experience. As you walked out, you could hear them already starting to talk differently, using shorter sentences, making wilder connections, thinking in spirals instead of straight lines. You'd infected them with something more powerful than any degree. You'd infected them with possibility. The parking lot felt different when you got back to your car. Same asphalt, same faded lines, same overflowing dumpster in the corner. But you saw it differently now. Not because anything had changed, but because you'd just proven something important. Not to them, their validation was nice, but ultimately irrelevant. You'd proven it to yourself. That all those years of being told you weren't smart enough, disciplined enough, educated enough, all of that was just noise. Your phone buzzed, text from the CEO. "The board wants to meet you. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp." You smiled and typed back, "I'll be there at 9:07. Sharp is for people who think time is linear. Then you cracked open another monster from the case in your trunk, put your car in drive, and headed toward whatever impossible thing was waiting to be made possible. Because that's what you do. You don't compete on their terms. You don't play by their rules. You don't measure yourself against their metrics. You exist in the spaces between their certainties, in the chaos they try to control, In the possibilities they're too educated to see. 7 PhDs, 7 minutes, 1 can of Monster, and a complete reimagining of what intelligence really means. They'll study what happened in that room. They'll try to reverse engineer it, to create frameworks and methodologies around it. And they'll probably write papers about it, present at conferences, add it to their curriculum, and they'll miss the point entirely. Because what happened wasn't about process or technique or even raw intelligence. It was about something much simpler and much more complex. It was about remembering that before we learned what was impossible, everything was possible. That before we were taught how to think, we just thought. That before we were given boxes to fit into, we didn't even know boxes existed. You hadn't outsmarted 7 PhDs. You just reminded them what thinking felt like before it got domesticated. And that, more than any algorithm or innovation, was the real disruption. Somewhere tonight, 7 brilliant people are lying awake, staring at their ceilings, wondering how someone with no credentials just revolutionized their entire worldview with nothing but caffeine and chaos. They're questioning every assumption, every methodology, every carefully constructed belief system that got them to where they are. And that questioning, that beautiful, terrifying uncertainty, that's where innovation really lives. You're probably already on to the next impossible thing. Another room full of experts who need to be reminded that expertise without imagination is just elaborate ignorance. Another problem that everyone says can't be solved by someone like you. Another can of Monster and another 7 minutes that will feel like 7 eternities to people who've forgotten what it's like to think at the speed of possibility. They try to control. In the possibilities they're too educated to see. 7 PhDs, 7 minutes, 1 can of Monster, and a complete reimagining of what intelligence really means. They'll study what happened in that room. They'll try to reverse engineer it, to create frameworks and methodologies around it. And they'll probably write papers about it, present at conferences, add it to their curriculum, and they'll miss the point entirely. Because what happened wasn't about process or technique or even raw intelligence. It was about something much simpler and much more complex. It was about remembering that before we learned what was impossible, everything was possible. That before we were taught how to think, we just thought. That before we were given boxes to fit into, we didn't even know boxes existed. You hadn't outsmarted 7 PhDs. You just reminded them what thinking felt like before it got domesticated. And that, more than any algorithm or innovation, was the real disruption. Somewhere tonight, 7 brilliant people are lying awake, staring at their ceilings, wondering how someone with no credentials just revolutionized their entire worldview with nothing but caffeine and chaos. They're questioning every assumption, every methodology, every carefully constructed belief system that got them to where they are. And that questioning, that beautiful, terrifying uncertainty, that's where innovation really lives. You're probably already on to the next impossible thing. Another room full of experts who need to be reminded that expertise without imagination is just elaborate ignorance. Another problem that everyone says can't be solved by someone like you. Another can of Monster and another 7 minutes that will feel like 7 eternities to people who've forgotten what it's like to think at the speed of possibility.